Sometimes you hear about a case, and it just kind of sticks with you. It makes you wonder about everything you thought you knew about truth and justice. And the case you brought us is definitely one of those cases. It's the story of Stephen Smith, a young man whose life was cut way too short, and a mother who has spent years trying to figure out what really happened to her son.
Yeah, it's a case that really shows how complicated small town life can be, where secrets can be buried really deep and getting justice can be incredibly hard, especially when powerful people might be involved.
Exactly, and the fact that it took another tragedy, the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh, to bring Stephen's case back into the spotlight is just, well, it's mind-blowing. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start from the beginning. Tell me about Stephen Smith. Who was he?
So Stephen was a 19-year-old nursing student. He was full of life and dreams. His mom, Sandy, describes him as a fighter. He was born prematurely, a twin. And even as a baby, he defied the odds. He had this incredible drive to succeed, to become a doctor one day, to make a difference in the world.
And then in July of 2015, his life was tragically cut short. He was found dead in the middle of a rural road in Hampton County, South Carolina. What was the initial explanation for his death?
Well, at first there was some confusion. The sheriff initially told the family that Stephen had been shot, but then that was quickly changed to a hit and run. However, right from the start, there are things that didn't add up about the scene. These raised some red flags for investigators, especially for Lieutenant Thomas Moore, who was with the Highway Patrol.
Okay, so let's talk about those inconsistencies. What didn't add up about the hit-and-run theory?
There are a few things. First, there was no vehicle debris at the scene. You would think you'd find, like, broken glass or pieces of the car or something, right? But there is nothing. And then second, Stephen's clothes were totally intact. His shoes were still on. In a typical hit and run, you would expect to see some damage to the clothing or some signs of being dragged, but that just wasn't the case here.
That is strange. What else?
Well, the position of Stephen's body seemed staged, almost like someone had placed him there on purpose. And then there was a matter of his car, which was found miles away, doors locked, and the gas cap open. It was almost as if someone was trying to make it look like he'd run out of gas and was walking for help when he was hit.
So if even the investigators had doubts about the hit-and-run ruling, why wasn't more done to investigate at the time?
Well, that's where the complexities of this case and the dynamics of this small town really come into play. You see, Hampton County was, and to some extent still is, under the influence of a very powerful family, the Murdaughs. For generations, they were the legal dynasty in that area, holding positions of power as lawyers and district attorneys. They had a lot of influence, and some people were afraid to speak out against them.
So are you saying that the Murdaughs might have had something to do with the initial investigation being mishandled?
I'm not saying that directly, but it's really important to understand the context here. Some investigators at the time suggested that the local sheriff's department might have been hesitant to push too hard on the case because of the Murdaughs' influence. And remember, this was all happening before the family's recent downfall and the exposure of their alleged wrongdoings.
Wow, that really paints a picture of how power can impact the pursuit of justice. It's almost like something you'd see in a movie. But this was Sandy's reality. Imagine being told your son died in a hit and run, but feeling deep down that something wasn't right. And then having these whispers about one of the most powerful families in the area possibly being involved.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, for sure. And while the Murdaugh's potential involvement is a big part of this story, we also have to look at the rumors that were going around town at the time. There were whispers of a group of young men in a truck, possibly hitting Stephen with something like a baseball bat, and even some mentions of Buster Murdaugh, Alex Murdaugh's son, being part of this group.
Wait, so there were actual witnesses who came forward with this information?
There were tips called into the police, yes. But remember, these were just rumors at this point. No concrete evidence ever emerged linking Buster or any specific group of individuals to Stephen's death.
So were these rumors ever investigated? Did the police look into Buster Murdaugh as a possible suspect?
They did receive tips about Buster possibly being involved, and there was even mention of an unreturned phone call from one of the people who was supposedly with him that night. However, Buster has always denied being involved in Stephen's death at all, and has provided an alibi for the night in question.
So even with the inconsistencies at the scene, the rumors and the potential influence of the Murdaughs, the initial investigation just stalled.
Essentially, yes. The Highway Patrol was the lead agency on the case. But they didn't have the resources or the cooperation from local authorities to really push the investigation forward. And meanwhile, Sandy was left with unimaginable grief and a growing feeling that something just wasn't right.
So what did she do? How did she handle this impossible situation?
She did what any mother would do in her position. She fought. She refused to let her son's case be forgotten. She started writing letters to anyone who would listen, the Attorney General, the FBI, even national media outlets. She was determined to get someone, anyone, to take a closer look at what really happened to Stephen.
Incredible to think about Sandy's determination, especially facing such a tough situation. Did anything come from her letter-writing campaign? Did anyone respond to her pleas for help?
It was actually through her persistence that one of the most important pieces of evidence came to light: Stephen's phone. Sandy was able to get the FBI involved to help unlock his phone, hoping it would reveal some clues about his movements and interactions leading up to his death.
That's fascinating. It makes you wonder what was on that phone that could help solve this case. Did they find anything important on it?
Well, the FBI agent who worked with Sandy at the time said that there was a lot of interesting information on the phone that needed to be looked at. But unfortunately, even with this new development, the case remained stagnant for years.
It's heartbreaking to think about Sandy clinging to this hope only to be met with more silence. But then, years later, something happened that would unexpectedly shake things up. It's almost hard to believe, really.
You're talking about the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh in 2021, right?
Exactly. It's like something out of a Greek tragedy. Here's this family, so powerful and influential, and suddenly their world comes crashing down. And in the middle of all the chaos of this high-profile case, Stephen's case, which had been cold for so long, is suddenly back in the spotlight.
It's a truly remarkable turn of events. As the investigation into the Murdaugh murders went on, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, announced that they were reopening Stephen Smith's case. And this time, they were treating it as a homicide.
Wow. Do we know what made SLED reopen the case? Was there some new evidence that they found?
SLED has been pretty quiet about what exactly led to this decision, but the timing is undeniable. The spotlight being on the Murdaugh family, with all their alleged secrets and wrongdoings, created a chance for Stephen's case to finally get the attention it deserved. It's almost as if things were closing in on them, and suddenly there was this renewed interest in unsolved cases that might be connected to the Murdaughs.
And it wasn't just law enforcement that was paying attention, right? The public was captivated by this story, too.
Absolutely. Remember, Sandy had been fighting for answers for years. But now, with the Murdaugh name in the headlines, people were finally listening. The media picked up the story. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to Stephen, and donations poured in to help Sandy continue her fight.
It's really amazing to see how much power persistence can have, but also how these high-profile cases can grab the public's attention and really push for change. It's almost like a domino effect. One tragedy leads to another one being looked at again, and suddenly there's this possibility for justice where there wasn't any before.
And with that renewed attention came some important developments. Thanks to the generosity of those who donated to her cause, Sandy was finally able to do something she had wanted to do for a long time: exhume Stephen's body for an independent autopsy.
Wow. That must have been an incredibly hard decision for her, emotionally and financially.
Yeah.
What was the goal of the exhumation and the independent autopsy?
The goal was to get a fresh perspective on the evidence. To have an expert who was completely independent of the initial investigation examine Stephen's remains and see if there was anything that had been missed or misinterpreted. Remember, there were always doubts about the hit-and-run ruling, and the independent autopsy was a chance to directly address those doubts.
So they exhumed Stephen's body in 2023, 8 years after his death. What did the independent autopsy show? Did it confirm or contradict the initial findings?
The independent autopsy, conducted by renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michelle Dupree, was a turning point in this case. Her findings confirmed that Stephen had died from a single blow to the head, but not from a baseball bat, as some other rumors had said. The injury was too precise, too linear for that.
So if it wasn't a baseball bat, what was it? Did Dr. Dupree have any ideas about what kind of object could have caused that type of injury?
Dr. Dupree, along with crime scene analyst Kenny Kinsey, concluded that the injury was consistent with being struck by an object attached to a speeding vehicle.
So we're back to the hit-and-run theory, but with a twist.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that the autopsy didn't show any other injuries on Stephen's body besides some road rash. This led Dr. Dupree and Mr. Kinsey to believe that he was killed right there on the road and not moved or staged afterward, as some had initially suspected.
So are we to understand that the independent autopsy actually contradicted the initial assessment of the scene? That's a pretty big revelation.
It is, and it brings up a whole new set of questions. If it was a hit and run, as the evidence now suggests, why wasn't there any vehicle debris found at the scene? And why did the initial investigators say the scene looked staged?
Those are great questions. If we're to accept the hit-and-run theory, we need explanations for those inconsistencies. Do we have any insights into what might have happened?
Kenny Kinsey, based on his analysis of the bloodstains and the position of Stephen's body, came up with a theory. He believes that Stephen was walking along the road, probably looking for help after his car broke down, and was hit by an object like a ladder or an extended side mirror sticking out from a passing vehicle.
Okay, so we're talking about a scenario where Stephen might have been a pedestrian when he was hit and not in his car.
Exactly. And this theory lines up with some of the early tips about a truck being involved, potentially with something sticking out from it. It also gives a possible reason for why there wasn't any vehicle debris at the scene. If the object that hit Stephen was attached to the vehicle, it wouldn't necessarily break off on impact.
That makes sense. But it still leaves us with one big question. Why didn't the driver stop? If it was an accident, wouldn't a decent person stop to help, to call for help?
You would think so, and that's the part that's hard to understand. Even if Stephen's death was an accident, leaving him to die in the road is a crime. Someone made a choice to run away. And that makes you think there might be more to this story than just a tragic accident.
It's almost like we're trying to see through this fog, trying to figure out what happened. We have the independent autopsy pointing to a hit and run, a possible theory about how it might have happened, and then this big question of motive. Why would someone leave the scene if it was really an accident?
You've got it, and that's where the investigation is right now. We have some answers, but we're still missing key parts of the puzzle.
So with all these unanswered questions, what's happening now? Where does the investigation stand today?
Well, a lot, because of Sandy's tireless efforts. The case is now in front of a grand jury.
For those of us who aren't lawyers, can you explain what a grand jury does exactly?
Sure. A grand jury is like a group of regular people. They look at the evidence presented by prosecutors, and they decide if there's enough to officially charge someone with a crime. It's kind of like a first step to see if a case should go to trial or not.
So the grand jury is actively investigating Stephen's death. What are they focusing on?
Well, from what we know, they've kind of moved away from those early rumors about a group of young men, and they're now looking at a smaller group of people who SLEE thinks might have really important information about what happened that night.
Is this smaller group connected to the Murdaugh family in any way? It seems like their name keeps coming up in this case.
It's true that the Murdaughs are a big part of this whole story, and it's definitely possible that some of the people being investigated by the grand jury have connections to them. But it's important to remember that just being connected to the Murdaughs doesn't mean someone is guilty of a crime.
Right, you can't assume guilt just because of who someone knows. But it's hard to ignore the timing of everything. The Murdaugh family's downfall and the renewed focus on Stephen's case happened at almost the same time.
The timing is definitely interesting. And with Alex Murdaugh now convicted of killing his wife and son, and the family's reputation in ruins, it makes you wonder if there are other crimes, other secrets that might come out.
What about Buster Murdaugh? Is he still a person of interest in this case?
His name is still being mentioned in connection with the case, but it's really important to say that he's always denied having anything to do with Stephen's death. He's given an alibi, and he hasn't been named as a suspect by investigators. The grand jury will have to decide if there's any real evidence that they need to look more closely at his potential involvement.
It sounds like there are still a lot of questions about this case. We've learned some things, but there are so many unanswered questions.
Yeah, that's how it is with cold cases, especially ones as complicated as this. It's like trying to put together a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. You might kind of see the picture, but without those key pieces, you can't see the whole thing.
And what about the information that was on Stephen's phone? Could that help solve this case?
It's definitely possible. Remember, the FBI agent said the information on the phone was interesting. It could have details about where Stephen was that night, who he talked to, and maybe even some clues about what he was thinking and feeling.
So that phone could be the key to finally figuring out what happened to Stephen. What's happening with that evidence now? Is the grand jury looking at what's on the phone?
We don't know for sure, but it would make sense for them to make that a priority. It could be the breakthrough they need to finally charge someone in this case.
You know, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I keep thinking about Sandy and how strong she is. After all these years of fighting for justice for her son, what do you think would really bring her a sense of closure?
I think for Sandy, real closure would mean knowing exactly what happened to her son that night. It's not just about finding out who did it and holding them accountable. It's about honoring Stephen's memory by finding out the truth and making sure that his story isn't forgotten.
It's a really powerful reminder that justice is about more than just punishment. It's about truth, accountability, and giving a voice to those who have been silenced.
Exactly. And this case really shows how important it is to never give up, to keep searching for the truth, even when it seems impossible.
So what happens next in this case?
The grand jury is going to keep looking at evidence and hearing from witnesses. We can only hope that they find enough to bring charges and finally bring some justice for Stephen and his family.
It feels like we're at a turning point in this story. Years of questions, of speculation, of a mother's tireless fight for answers. It all seems to be coming to a head.
And while we wait for the grand jury to make a decision, it's important to remember that Stephen Smith was more than just a name in a headline. He was a young man with dreams and a whole future ahead of him, a life that was tragically taken away.
This case is a powerful reminder that the road to justice can be long and difficult, but it's a road worth traveling.
And sometimes it takes the dedication of a grieving mother, the persistence of investigators, and the unwavering belief in the power of truth to help us get there. Let's hope that in Stephen's case, justice will win in the end.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. If you have any thoughts or theories about this case, please share them with us on our social media. And as always, we'll keep following this story and let you know about any new developments.